This is Anthony Kilner from Supernal Magazine Australia, and we have the privilege of interviewing Peter Harris, who is the founder of Australia's Representatives, or OZRPs as they're called. Peter, thank you for joining us here at Supernal.
Thanks, Anthony. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Well, give us a little bit of an insight into you, Peter Harris, and then we'll talk about where OZRPs has come from and what your direction is.
Sure. Well, in 2003, I founded a federal political party called Family First, and that party competed in the 2004 election. And we had a series of agendas back then. We were concerned with the family values and the deterioration of those values in society. And so Family First was a great vehicle to represent those core values that I think everybody in our society embraces. You know, there was a lot of social engineering and planning going on back in those days, and there was the demise of the Democrats, who had done a very effective job for many years of keeping the bastards honest. So my objective was to create a party that really took the middle ground and continued to do the same as the Democrats, without having an extreme agenda either way, and really holding those parties to account. And the party was very successful in achieving its objectives. It nearly got 4 senators elected, and we ended up with 1 out of Victoria. And we had a very good working relationship, I would say, with both Liberal and Labor back in those days. We regularly met with the leaders of both parties and negotiated policy outcomes and issues, and did a lot of work to support the basis of family values that, in my mind, were deteriorating back then. So in 2006, I felt that I'd done my work in Family First, and I resigned as chairman of the party and left it to others, and decided to just continue on with my own business activities and really remain that way until probably August last year, when I saw a massive deterioration in democracy coming, and I was very concerned about some of the things that were being said by our political leaders. So yeah, my background was essentially establishing a party. I think we in those days ran about 120 lower house candidates, and we ran in 6 states, Senate teams, and it was a tremendous experience in getting insight into the political world, how decisions are made, and how to essentially build a party from nothing in a very short period of time.
So a very good background, and obviously that's where the OZRPs has come in, and why it's sort of so new and you're still growing. So what led to the creation of this party now?
Well, I have to say, Scott Morrison. You know, Scott Morrison in August last year made some lunatic statements, and those statements were around the COVID jab being made mandatory for every Australian. I thought it was unusual that a Prime Minister would speak so off the cuff. It was almost a thought bubble that he was going to make this COVID jab mandatory at a time when it was clearly in development, it was clearly experimental, and it was clearly not invented yet. It had not been approved by one agency anywhere in the world. And for a Prime Minister to be so careless with his words. And then what happened from that was he got beaten up on social media in the thousands. People said, you know, told him on his own social media what they thought of him. And within a few hours or a day or so, he came out and said, oh, well, it won't be mandatory, be mandatory as possible. And having had the privilege and opportunity to have dealt with Prime Ministers previously, I think that was probably, in my mind, one of the most un-prime ministerial acts I've ever seen. in my life, and I began to consider a process in which we could hold this sort of loose leadership accountable and bring about change in the Australian political system. My wife and I were also doing a speaking tour around Australia, and we've presented and spoken to probably 6,000 or 7,000 Australians over the last 6 months. And as I was travelling around, I realised that Australia's got some pretty severe and significant issues that need to be dealt with in broader policy areas. And what I recognised is that both Liberal and Labor have been engaging in policy that's been dividing our nation for an extended period and dividing households even with their narrative and with their policies. And I thought it's time for something different. And I also thought that, these two parties don't have a right to govern Australia. They don't have a birthright to govern. They don't, for the last 70 years, demonstrate any interest in hearing the voice of the Australian people. They've had billions of dollars, but most likely billions of dollars in funding from the Australian Electoral Commission to get elected each time there's a contest. And they haven't spent one red cent on creating systems and processes to listen to the people. And that really, that reflection deeply concerned me, that we've got a political system that has now become totalitarian in nature. I mean, you just look at Dan Andrews. Dan's back. He's locked Melbourne down already. Mm-hmm. And we have no evidence whether the cases that they've been locked down for, where they're in quarantine, are asymptomatic, or whether they're actual cases of disease. I mean, they're entitlements that the Australian people have a right to ask. And you have Dan Andrews, for example, getting on 3AW radio yesterday saying, this is safe and it works and it's our way out of this. And the problem with that is it's a lie. How can anyone logically say these jabs are safe and that they work when they've been around for 2 minutes? And the TGA public assessment reports even say themselves that there's no long-term safety or efficacy studies, and they're provisionally approved, and there's 5 years for them to gather the data. This is probably the biggest human experiment in the history of the world. And even Greg Hunt said that, our health minister. So there's all of these anomalies that are going on. And what I felt was it was time that there was a new party that actually did something novel, which was listen to the people, which was get their candidates to sign a pact with the community and say, these are the systems and processes that we will use to hear your voice and take them to the Parliament of Australia. And so OZRPs will run 151 candidates in all of the House of Representatives seats. We want to govern. We want to govern Australia. It's a bold statement. Many people would have thought it was a ridiculous statement a year ago, but we have 50 marginal seats in this country, which represents millions and millions of Australians that are completely disillusioned with the political system. And it's no one's fault. It's the two parties that have sought to dominate the Australian people and not listen to the Australian people, and they have now left. These parties have had over 70 years to get it right, and they haven't. And so there's a new group of people coming through that promise to listen to the people. They'll put it in black and white. They'll invent systems. They'll do weekly polling on issues. They won't rush legislation through the Parliament. They won't even avoid the Parliament. We've got Scott Morrison completely avoiding the Parliament on many of the directives and regulations that are now being put through under this emergency period. And he's not even going to the Parliament. He kills COAG, which is a very public event where the media and the state leaders have some sort of argy-bargy, and he creates a national cabinet, which is now cabinet in confidence or commercial in confidence, so no one can talk about what's discussed in that. So once again, the Australian people have lost all semblance of transparency with these people, and their time's up. Sorry, I get passionate.
I think we have to, and the magazine stance on this is, we're not taking sides and we're not picking fights. But I think what you said earlier about families being divided because they're not sure and they can't find the right information, the right narrative that gives them confidence to move forward. That's something very real that I've experienced and seen, and that's I think that's what's needed in politics. And the biggest problem is everybody says, well, I don't like this and I don't like that. And who do we go to? And this is, I guess, what you're speaking to.
Well, what terrifies me is we're a Labor and Liberal in the federal domain challenging and questioning this behaviour. They're not. It's because they're in lockstep. They're in lockstep with the government, and they're not prepared to speak up and fight for the people. So they've all become irrelevant from my perspective. They've all become groups that want the benefits of power, but they don't want the duties of power. So what I mean by that is, when you are there to represent the people, you've got to work hard. Functioning a real democracy is not for the faint-hearted. It's hard work. There's divided opinion. But let me give you an example on climate. So in Australia, we have federal policy that divides people. So you're either a climate skeptic or you're a climate believer. But when I was speaking in Byron Bay, I said to them, look, let's just talk about creating policy that unites us. Here's a thought. What about if we take the concept of being good stewards of our environment, and we implement plans that make the environment and climate sustainable? Does everyone agree with that statement? And there's not a person in Australia that will disagree with that point of view, regardless of the science. A political leader's responsibility is to unite people and bring people on the journey and bring people to the point that is responsible policy in each of the areas that they're actively engaged. And a Prime Minister's responsibility is not to dribble out narrative that divides the nation. A Health Minister's responsibility is not to talk in a way that divides families. And they've done nothing but do that. And so OZRP stands for the people. OZRPs will do things that unite people and will champion policies that resolve problems, long-standing problems in this country, like water, the cost of fuel, the lack of resolution of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders issues. These things go on and on and on, never been resolved, and constantly divide the nation.
Yeah, well, I think anything that can unite our nation under the current situation that we're in, bearing in mind, we're in lockdown number 5 here in Melbourne, but, I think anything that can unite the nation and deal with these issues in a way that is honest and transparent. I think that's the thing that frustrates me, is the lack of transparency, the creation of what the media is doing in the background, that sort of stuff. Says me that's in the media. But I think the lack of transparency is really obvious at the moment, and you can't get a straight answer out of anybody.
Well, also, the media is meant to be the immune system of a representative democracy. Mm-hmm. It's meant to be out there investigating. It's meant to be the skeptic in our community, challenging and questioning everything. Mm-hmm. And what we see is a media in lockstep with the narrative. They're promoting a narrative without investigation. And the reality is, I call on all journalists in Australia to fulfil their obligation to report honestly to the Australian people. Why do you not hold people like Scott Morrison, Greg Hunt, Daniel Andrews to account for clearly misleading and deceptive statements? I mean, a lot of these statements are made out of the Parliament. So one has to question, at what point are these individuals held accountable for their misleading and deceptive actions? I mean, you just have to look at the federal advertising campaign promoting the jab, the COVID jab. Safe, effective and free. And the reality is they cannot legitimately make the claim that it's safe and effective unless they've changed the definition of safe and effective, unless they've got a smart lawyer somewhere to define it for them so that anybody that challenges it has to fall into a very narrow definition of safe and effective. So we're playing semantics, we're playing games, we're playing with the lives of people. And my view is that these politicians need to be held to account. The representatives of these parties that are out there today are not interested in the voice of the people. We've seen people that are involved in our organisations write tens of thousands of letters, and all they get every day is automatic responses. And they don't get meaningful responses, maybe from a few. And they're not listening to the people. But by God, they listen to their party power brokers' vested interests, because at the end of the day, if they don't do what they're told, they get disendorsed. And so, you know what? The extension of the state, the closing down of people being able to talk about things has got out of control. You know, doctors not being able to speak about things like ivermectin and those sort of issues as credible solutions as well. If they don't follow the narrative, they have the TGA, they have the AMA all over them wanting to take away their registration. So that's not a way to run a democratic society.
No, and it certainly doesn't give people an opportunity to have a voice without being labelled. So, you know, you mentioned that before, and you know, we get labelled because that's a way of stopping people from actually going in and delving into the debate on situations. So, you know, I asked a question about what's in a vaccine in general, and I'm suddenly called an anti-vaxxer, and it's like, well,
yeah.
No, actually, I'm not. I asked a question. That meaningful debate is something I think we're missing across the board.
I mean, look, I think that's where, you know, it's another big problem. We have conflicted advisors advising the government, hugely conflicted advisors. And the problem with that is that they have now taken it to the point where if you ask a question, you're labelled. That's what's going on. And a lot of these media groups and even retailing groups have got interests in some of these vaccine organisations. The Future Fund, for example, has $2 billion of investment in global pharmaceutical groups that are producing these drugs. So, you know, it's time for transparency. It's time for all of these things to be disclosed by government. It's time for conflicted advisors to be completely kicked out of Canberra, to be completely kicked out of representatives' offices, because it's time for independent specialists, and there's plenty out there, to begin to take over and provide transparent and honest feedback. You know, I am in the seat of Rebecca Sharkey in Adelaide. And the thing that concerns me about a response I got from Rebecca Sharkey asking her about the rollout to the Indigenous communities when the TGA public assessment reports clearly say there are no studies whatsoever, yet our government makes it a priority to jab the Indigenous communities. Doesn't make sense to me. But when I write a letter to her and ask her about that issue, her response is, I'm only an independent, I have to follow what comes from the Department of Health. Well, you know what? That's not true. You're actually an elected member of the federal parliament. You've got somewhere between 80 and 120,000 people in your electorate that would willingly put up their hand to form an investigative group, doctors, all sorts of people, to provide independent feedback on these issues. It's time that we actually started using our brains in politics. And it's time for the people to wake up that most of these politicians are asleep at the wheel. Most of them are not thinking logically. You know, even with changes to the Biosecurity Act, what became clear was that most of the politicians that approved it did not know what they had approved.
Yeah, I suspect that was the case, because otherwise, you know, why would they have come through?
We've got evidence of that. They responded by saying, this is not in the legislation. We had to send it back and say, actually, here it is. This is what you approved. on the way through Parliament, why is it that you don't know what you approved? They're asleep at the wheel and they're not representing the people, and that's why OZRPs is here.
Right. Well, that's a good argument. It's a good discussion. I think if we can get more sort of discussion around that for a lot more people, it might just help them to understand where we're at in Australia, because there's a lot not very nice around the country at the moment, and a lot of transparency, which is what I'm asking for, is just to be transparent.
Yeah.
Don't bury things in reams of paper that take us, hours and hours and hours to find out, and even then you've got to question what you're reading. So
what's going on? You saw the march in the people marching in Melbourne last night. And one thing I have always said about what's going on here is totalitarians always overreach. They always go too far. And they always go too far without empirical evidence to prove their positions. And even Alan Jones and people like that are talking about this now. And guess what? The people always stand up. And the people always determine at what point they need to stand up. But when they really know that that they're really being misled, the people stand up en masse. We've seen that all around the world in every totalitarian society that's evolved. And the reality is we are now living in a police state. And so the people will begin to stand up. I hope they do it sooner than later, because there is definitely a political agenda here, which is completely baseless with respect to evidence and facts. And the people need to stand up now, and they can change it. I don't want people to lose hope. I want people to get angry, and I want people to use their pen or pencil when it comes to election day and change what's happening in this nation. And the change that I'll be promoting, I know you can't, but the change I'll be promoting is ticking number 1, OZRPs, because we will bring back the voice of the people, and we will respect the freedoms and liberties of the people. We will seriously look at a whole range of policy issues, not just look, but implement policy that unites us and that builds our economy and protects our borders and our national security, rebuilds our manufacturing, does all of those things, ensures sufficiency of supply. I mean, we had a merchant banker for a prime minister for a few minutes, and in that time, he completely commercialised and monopolised the water system in this country, and now our primary producers can't get water. All this stuff has got to be fixed. This has just been mismanagement and incompetence at the highest levels that you can imagine.
So, question sort of not off topic, but just out of the blue. Do you think the governments have gone too far now for them to be able to say, I'm sorry, our medical advice has changed, we can step back from what we've done? Do you think they've gone too far in that space?
Well, if you had an ounce of humility, that's what you would do. That's what you would do. I mean, people accept people making mistakes. But what the nature of our politicians is to seek to cover up the mistakes. So I'm of the view, and this is why we started OZRPs, I'm of the view that it's too late for them. I don't believe they can step back from their totalitarian nature anymore, from their vested interests. They've demonstrated that over 70 plus years, they're not committed to innovating and improving ways to listen to the people. They've used in recent decades technology for tyranny, to track and trace and control people. They haven't used it to hear the voices of the people. And I tell you, this is why they're so out of touch. And this is why they're doing things that they think are right, is because they're not in touch with what the people are saying. They don't have any systems to help them do that. So I would love to answer your question and say an appeal to Scott Morrison, an appeal to Greg Hunt, an appeal to Daniel Andrews to turn back and listen to the people and look at the evidence. I would appeal to them to do that. Do I think they've got the capacity to do that? No, I don't. But we can always hope.
And, you know, we put it out there, and again, we're trying to, you know, us as a magazine is, as you know, is about trying to alleviate fear and misdirection and all the rest of it. So that's what we're trying to do. So, Peter, thank you very much for your chat. If people would like to know a little bit more about what OZREPS is about and want to be able to contact you and actually have a say, how can they do that easily?
Yesterday was our 100th day birthday, and so we've been pretty busy, and they can go to our website ozreps.org and become a member, or have a look at some of the information there. We're constantly evolving and improving things at the moment. We've got our application in and have had for some time to be a registered political party, and we're going through that process at the moment. So all the information that people want to know is there, and we'd love to hear from people. We'll be opening up, if we want to hear the voice of the people, we will be opening up shortly people's perspectives on public policy. We've got some broad areas that we want to address. The sufficiency of inputs for primary producers, in my mind, is really fundamental in a whole range of ways for Australia. We've got food bowls and places like that, the Riverina, that are starved of water. We need to fix those things urgently. But yeah, we'd love people to engage and give us their feedback and bring their issues to us.
Excellent. Well, people can get to there, ozreps.org. Peter, thank you very much for spending some time with us and having your expression on what you want to see in Australia and a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anthony.